Hello, and welcome to a conversation about innovations to improve treatment of rare cancers. I am Steven Collins, the CEO of Matter. At Matter, our mission is to accelerate the pace of change of healthcare. We run an incubator for healthcare startups and have supported more than 1,000 companies from around the world that have gone on to raise more than $5 billion to fuel their growth. We also run 6 to 8 accelerators per year in partnership with large health systems and life sciences companies, payers, associations. We're currently running a number of them, including one on health equity, one on oral health. There's one on family caregiving, running one on public health security, one on the mental health of young professionals. We also work with large enterprises to help them build their innovation capabilities with a suite of education and training and insight services that help them make sense of emerging technologies and figure out how to harness them. And we convene leaders for conversations about how innovations can improve health and healthcare. Today's conversation will be about rare cancers, which, depending on which source you use, comprise 20 to 40% of all cancer diagnoses in the United States each year, which is a lot, considering that there will be around 2 million new cancer diagnoses this year. It is challenging enough, and we'll get into this conversation, to develop therapies for common cancers, but for rare cancers, there are unique challenges and also unique opportunities. We have 3 people in the field with us to discuss this topic. So Marshall Thompson is the president of the Rare Cancer Research Foundation. He has degrees in biology, computer science, genetics, and genomics, and a career that spans science, engineering, and business. He took leadership of the foundation last year. Thanks, Marshall, for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen.
Phil Tennant has been in the pharmaceutical industry for more than 30 years, including roles with Merck, AstraZeneca, BMS, and Astellas, where he led the U.S. oncology business. He is now the chief commercial officer at Precigen, which is a development stage gene and cell therapy company that's focused on immuno-oncology, autoimmune disorders, and infectious diseases. Phil, welcome. Edrice Simmons leads Abbvie's U.S. oncology business, where she is leading the commercialization efforts for a number of therapies for rare and even ultra-rare cancers. Between roles with Abbvie and previously with Eli Lilly, Edrice has spent more than 25 years in the industry, and she brings a unique perspective on innovation to her work. Edrice, welcome to you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Steve.
I will also mention that both Edrice and Phil serve on the Matter board of directors. The goal of this conversation is to learn more about rare cancers and the barriers to discovering and developing and commercializing effective therapeutics to treat them, and hopefully getting closer to answering the question of what will it take to get to a world in which every rare cancer is treatable with an effective therapeutic. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A function. I will weave them into the conversation as appropriate. Marshall, I would like to start off the conversation with you with some level setting, some basics. What is your definition of a rare cancer? How many are there? And how many of them can be effectively managed with existing therapies? Sure.
Thanks, Steve. As I think you mentioned in your intro, it kind of depends who you ask. NCI, so the National Cancer Institute of the NIH in the US, has a specific definition that rare cancers are any cancer where there are 15 or fewer cases per 100,000 total cancer cases per year in the US. That equates to about 40,000 new cases a year. Anything roughly less than 40,000 would qualify. The European Cancer Commissions have a slightly different number. They use 6 instead of, 6 and 15 instead of, 6 in 100,000 instead of 15 in 100,000. But once you sort of start looking a little more carefully, what I think becomes interesting is sort of reversing the definition and saying, if a patient or a group of patients is rare enough, is uncommon enough that you could go to a pharma company and say, hey, can you run a phase 3 trial on this because there are no treatment options? And they say, no, we can't do that, right? I would say that that's also a pretty good metric for this is an underserved rare population. And it turns out those show up in places like, genetic subsets of more common cancers or different age groups or sort of presentations, right? A close friend of mine has bladder cancer, which is quite common. It's the sixth most common cancer in the country, but he's recently developed a complication called leptomeningeal disease, which is extremely rare, even in other cancers, and is basically unheard of in bladder cancer. And so I think it's worthwhile to remember that even if you, sort of based on the original diagnosis, don't qualify on that 15 100,000, there's still a lot of underserved and unserved need in groups where the presentation really doesn't follow the book, if you will. And I think that leads into your sort of second question, which again, if you sort of look at publications, it's a little hard to sort of sum up. I mean, you said, how many are there, right? By that definition that I gave, that's 400 different indications probably qualify as rare cancers. Are there treatments for all of them? Certainly not. How many are there? NIH says about 5% of rare diseases have effective treatments. That's all rare diseases, not just cancers. You can extrapolate, though, that, the numbers are not good. In the case of cancer, obviously, many times we have sort of general treatments like surgery, radiation, broad chemotherapy, right? In many of these rare tumor types, that's it, right? If it's surgically resectable, they'll try that. If it's accessible for radiation, they'll try that. If, maybe they'll give you chemotherapy, but all of that is really just based on, well, this kind of kills any cancer to some degree, but we know it's not very good, as opposed to a much more targeted, this is the right thing for the patient with XYZ cancer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marshall, what you're saying, what really bums me out is that we're talking about chemotherapies and these palliative treatments, and it's just fundamentally not acceptable. It's not acceptable for any cancer, and I think we've got to bring better treatments for patients where they can actually live with cancer and live their lives. And so I think even for these rare and ultra rare diseases, certainly we at Abbvie, we just look for a day when we don't have to brute force, treatments like chemotherapy. And again, I know many people that we love have had chemotherapy and they're living, and we praise that. But in the thought of greater innovation, we just have to do better. Whether it's rare cancer or ultra rare cancers, but certainly for ultra rare cancers, we've got to do better.
Edrice, what are the barriers to doing better? Marshall said 5% of rare diseases have effective treatments, and to your point, like that just sounds unacceptable in this day and age. And obviously, you're committed to trying to change that. I guess the two ways of looking at that. One is, why is that? What's your take on why it is that we're in the world that we're in right now when there are so many kind of innovative drugs that have come out over the last stretching back a while, but even you just think the last 5-10 years, there's some 20 years. I mean, some dramatic innovations that have changed the way so many conditions can be managed and treated. Why is it that we're in this position? And the kind of converse is, why would a pharma company invest in developing a drug for a cancer, I mean, any rare disease, but a cancer where there might only be a few tens of thousands of patients or even a few hundred patients? What is the rationale that a company would use that's trying to figure out, how do I deploy my resources in order to drive a return for shareholders? Why would they go down this path?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, and Phil and I have talked about this a lot, haven't been in the same space for a while, but, I think all of us, no matter what company you are, we go into this business because we want to transform the life of every patient. It doesn't matter if you have a cancer that's more common, as Marshall said, or a more rare cancer. But I will tell you, Steven, we're learning how to do this. These populations are very small. Our standard way of finding these patients, things like research, obviously getting people in clinical trials. We really have to think about more innovative ways that I don't think it's that our companies don't want to, we're just learning. I mean, I take just our own company as we're going into ultra rare spaces, we're having to rethink how we come to market with trials. We need to think about things like partnerships with institutions, people, like Marshall and the foundation that he's working with. The standard ways that we try to find these patients to even give them the treatments is just different. We need regulatory flexibility. I will tell you, some of the primary endpoints our regulatory bodies are not yet comfortable with. And, we have to come up with sometimes these new primary endpoints to get the regulatory bodies to join us in trying to bring treatments forward. So I just think we all strive to be in this business. We want to transform the lives of all patients in cancer, but we're learning, while people are having these rare cancers that are suffering, we're learning at the same time of how to bring our treatments forward that is probably more uncommon than we have in the future. It's more uncommon in our trials, not these large trials that we normally have. We've got very small trials. Some of them are 20 patients. And the FDA has been really good with giving us kind of breakthrough designations, but still we have to join with them to make sure they get comfortable with how we are running our trials. So we're all well-intentioned. And Phil, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. We've talked about this, but it's tough. It's really tough to find ways to bring treatments to market for these very ultra rare diseases.
Yeah, Phil, you've been involved in commercialization of medicines to treat rare diseases. I'd love your perspective on the opportunity and the reasons why maybe there hasn't been as much progress to date, or your take on that, and the reasons for companies to focus potentially on rare diseases versus more prevalent diagnoses. And I guess I should also ask you, I think Precigen is not as much of a household name yet as Abbvie is. So maybe also a couple, a minute on what the company is would probably be helpful too.
Sure. Picking up on something Edrice said, I think our ability to make an impact in the rare disease area speaks to the very heart of why our industry exists. And I think that level of attraction will always be there. The ability to intervene where patients have few, if any, treatment options or old options that are knee-jerk responses and are not tailored to that particular condition. The ability to have impact there, that's why we exist, I think. So that drive from a fundamental mission perspective, I think will always be there for us to deal with what's difficult from a disease perspective. I think there are other things in favor of addressing rare diseases, the small patient population, the precision medicine nature of many of the approaches that we're developing for those patients mean that we have a good chance of making a significant impact and pulling that through to demonstrate the true value, both clinically and economically, of our medicines in the way that we think about these from a health economics perspective. Because of the small population, but because of the technology and the scientific breakthroughs we're having, I think we have an opportunity in rare diseases to build a really compelling story. There are incentives, tax incentives, exclusivity incentives. There are waivers of certain fees associated with developing drugs if you are tackling a rare disease, if you have orphan drug status. And all of these can help manufacturers think, or positively weigh that trade-off between other areas and rare diseases. There are definite challenges, and we'll talk about those. But for those reasons, I think rare diseases are always going to be attractive. The scientific pace of change, the high unmet need, and the ability to tailor a benefit and clearly outline what that benefit is all mean it's still going to be an attractive area. You talked about Precigen, so we have a couple of platforms in the cell and gene space, CAR-T, and also an adenovirus viral vector platform that we're developing for, in this case, a benign tumor. But again, it's high unmet need, rare diseases with very few solutions that are working for patients at the moment in the healthcare system. I just came from Phoenix. I was at the meeting on the Mesa, so the cell and gene therapy, where big pharma, small pharma, regulators, partners all got together over the last 3 days to talk about how we get better at navigating through the current healthcare environment so that these breakthroughs, these scientific breakthroughs, can get to the right patients at the right time. And so that thirst for moving forward collectively as an ecosystem is very much alive and kicking. And I think that is what it ultimately will take to continue to be successful here, is that stakeholder approach from an ecosystem vantage point.
Yeah. Edrice, were you going to jump in?
No.
Okay. Yeah. So I want to come back around a number of the things that you both have said around collaborations and stakeholders and regulatory and clinical trials and incentives and all of that. I do, Marshall, I want to come back to you and if you think about the how this all happens, it starts with research, and that is kind of where you're planted. Tell us more about what your foundation does, and the problem that you're solving, and which, as we've gotten to know each other, I have come to better appreciate how significant of a problem this is, just at a foundational level, before any of this other stuff happens around patients and trials or anything else. There's some real foundational work that needs to be done, and that's hard, and it can be hard to do. So I talk a little bit about what it is, what's the problem you're solving and what's the foundation do?
Sure. So I think you captured it in pretty precise terms, which is, and we think about it as an infrastructure problem. If you, as a scientist or a clinician, or even as Edrice and Phil mentioned, clinical trialist, you want to enroll in a trial, and you're focused on these rare cancers, these rare diseases. I think it's a rare disease problem in general, but we focus on cancer. One of the things that makes it so challenging to do this work is that there's a distribution in time and space of the patients, the data, the samples that facilitate all of that downstream work. And by that distribution, I mean, by definition, these things are rare. So even if you're at some of the biggest hospitals in the country, you can't be sure that, within a year, 2 or 3 patients with that particular rare disease are going to come in your front door of your clinic. Unfortunately, the way that most sites, systems, organizations do this research work tends to be pretty siloed based on who the patients are who come into their hospital, right? Researchers in the sort of preclinical, very academic sense can tend to work well with the surgeons and the pathologists at their own institutions. They build collaborations, and then they go to those people and they say, hey, I'd love to study, a particular cancer type, but I need the tissue, right? I need some samples from those patients when they come into the clinic so that I can take them back to the lab and test drugs on them, or even before that, do really foundational molecular biology and understand what are the mutations, what are the gene expression patterns that are driving these tumors. If you're studying, non-small cell lung cancer, you can usually find a surgeon in your hospital who can help you out with some of those biopsy samples. On the flip side, if you're studying uveal melanoma, which is what our founder, so the founder of our organization was a uveal melanoma patient, depending on the hospital you're at, there might be a very small handful of patients that walk through the front door with that disease in a year. So the access for researchers to those materials, whether it be tissue to do molecular biology, sequencing, make model systems like cell lines and mouse models, whether it be data to go do data mining and try to understand what's the molecular profile of these things, what are the genomes look like, what are the expressions, or, as I mentioned before, just access to the patients to say, like, hey, there's a phase 1 trial or a phase 2 trial. We need to get patients who have this particular profile together and get them enrolled in that. All of that becomes not only difficult and sometimes strictly prohibitive in making progress on those fronts. So that's really the core of the problem that we're trying to solve at RCRF. And the way we've approached that, one of the ways, and the first sort of longest running, is through tissue donation. So we have a program that we call pattern.org, where patients anywhere in the US can find out about us, sign up online. If they're going to have a surgery, they can consent to donate their living tissue from that surgery directly into the research ecosystem. And so the way we do that is, no matter where the patient's being seen, right? Whether it's a big academic hospital or a small clinic or a regional center, we find out who their clinician is from their signing up online. We call their hospital, we call the pathologist, we call their surgeon, say, look, this is the patient would like to donate their rare tumor tissue. We have these research projects on the other hand who want to get that tissue to do this kind of science with. We send a kit, a collection kit via FedEx. The surgeon puts the sample in the collection kit, and then that live living tumor tissue gets shipped overnight, usually within 14 to 16 hours, to one of these research labs who can do all of that kind of foundational work, understanding the biology of these diseases. And one of the really compelling reasons that that's been so effective, I think, is that we sort of broke down that notion that you have to be in the same physical place as a researcher where the patient is, right? We like to sort of joke, like FedEx goes everywhere. So if FedEx can drive to your clinic, we can get tissue from there into the hands of these researchers who, there are only a handful of these people who are really focused on some of these particularly rare diseases and really have the scientific capabilities and the lab resources and whatever. So let's bring the samples to them. So that's one of the major programs that we've had. That's resulted in the generation of a bunch of cell models. So there are now 60 some odd cell lines and organoid models that are now publicly available for researchers to get access to, that they can grow up in the lab and study, that didn't exist before we started this program, right? They were developed by a lab who take those samples and let them grow in the lab and figure out how to keep them alive in a way that other researchers can benefit from that. The sort of second tier of that same belief is what we're really pushing forward today, which is doing the same kind of thing with patient data. So the idea being, this rare cancer tissue is very precious. It's also, there's logistics and the timing is hard. But it turns out if you generate really good data, both on the clinical story of the patient, what drugs have they had, how do they present clinically, what does their histopathology look like, what were their responses to those drugs, and then also hopefully things like sequencing and molecular profiling of their peripheral blood. If you put those two things together into a data repository, I can share that with you, I can share that with Phil, I can share that with Edrice, everybody, and it doesn't sort of get worse over time, right? You have a very limited ability to share fresh tissue because by definition, it doesn't last. Data, on the other hand, is sort of infinitely scalable in a lot of ways. So we're now pushing forward the ability to not only do continue the tissue work I mentioned, but expand into patients donating their data, also generating data from all of those tissue samples that have been donated, putting all of it into a central place so that any researcher or bioinformatician who has those kinds of questions about rare cancers can go access that data, do bioinformatics on it, do hypothesis development, and hopefully drive toward new diagnostics, new therapeutics, new options.
There's so much about what you said. I mean, I was in the pharma industry a while ago and I never worked on a rare disease, but I took everything you just said, I just took for granted because of the kinds of, and I just find it very interesting to sort of think about these barriers and challenges in the rare disease space that just seem so fundamental to the, just basics of trying to figure out, how do you even begin to develop a therapy? So Phil, when you were at Astellas, you were responsible for a drug for a rare type of gastric cancer. And just, the things that Marshall just talked about, what were the challenges that you faced in developing the drug and getting it to market?
Yeah, it was pre-commercialization stage, but we used to talk about there being two launches in one because it was biomarker driven. It was a subset of the population that we identified through a biomarker test that 35% of these patients expressed a particular protein. They were the patients who were more likely to respond to the drug. But it was two launches in one. You had the usual stuff that goes along with the development of the drug, but then you have the parallel and intersecting pathway of the companion diagnostic to make sure that actually comes together at the point of commercialization so that, the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. One without the other was not going to work from a commercialization perspective. So that added a degree of complexity, especially for a biomarker that was new, wasn't on the scene. And so then you get into the questions of, well, how is that test going to be taken up in practice? Are labs going to be okay with a centralized process where you have maybe a handful of labs developed across the country that you could send your tissues to, or will it be more lab developed tests? The degree of centralization or decentralization there is important. Can you hitch the new biomarker test to the existing tests in that arena? So HER2 testing, PD-L1, they were all well established. So can you add yours to that screen, if you like, for it to become a reflex test in this area? New customer base in terms of pathologists. We hadn't necessarily had a deep and meaningful relationship with pathology, but this was a brand new customer base that we had to build a relationship, get to know, understand, work with, and build a positive relationship with. And then the tissue issue that was raised, for making sure that with the proliferation of biomarkers in many of these areas, do you have enough tissue to cope and to screen these patients or segment these patients further? Because without that, again, you're not going to get to that precision level of treatment. Stepping back from a drug development perspective, for some of these rare diseases, they have no standard of care or inconsistent standard of care, particularly if you go beyond the US into other parts of the world. And so in this particular case, our pivotal studies, our registrational studies, had two different types of chemo backbone to cope with or to reflect the standard of practice in different parts of the world. And, that's an additional cost and complexity in the development program to make sure that you're covering as many of those bases when you actually then come to market. So those are just some of the additional complexities and costs that we had to figure into the way that we were developing the drug.
You mentioned biomarkers and companion diagnostics, and just want to dive into that a little bit. Being able to sort of have a disease that's well characterized and the pathology is understood is again something that I think in a lot of cases people just take for granted. But when you're dealing with these rare conditions, obviously you need the tissue in order to do the characterization. But even beyond that, can you maybe, Phil, just talk a little bit more about the challenge around diagnosing and coming up with an accurate diagnosis? And if you don't have that sort of well-characterized pathology and the availability of diagnostics, how does that even, how do you, and then just from your vantage point, you're trying to, you've got a drug that works, it can treat people, it can, people can really benefit from this, but people don't, doctors don't necessarily know who the patients are, and how does that work? And then Edrice, I'll turn to you because I know you're in a similar situation.
I mean, I'll make some introductory comments here. I think, all of those issues are issues in non-rare cancers in general. Those are some of the things that you're challenged with. How do you inform and educate the stakeholder base so that they understand what the patients look like, who they are, and who's likely to respond to your drug? It's just a more acute issue if you're further segmenting those patients because you need to use an approved diagnostic test to identify them and the complexity that goes along with that. If you're introducing a brand new biomarker, there's a tremendous amount of education that you need for people to understand why the biomarker is there, how they use it, what type of test they should use, whether they can develop it locally, whether they need to refer to a central lab. All of that is an added complexity in the way you think about your go-to-market model. I don't think it's necessarily any different to how you tend to think about commercializing and thinking about identifying patients in general. It's just it's more acute and there are more nuances, I think, associated with it when you drill down into those specific subpopulations.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of confusion too. We're talking about tissue, we're talking about biomarkers, things like non-small cell lung cancer, but even in blood cancers. I think because we're talking about cancer, there's sometimes confusion, and oncologists, we all know the way that they operate is they're just trying to save people's lives. So sometimes you have cancers where treatments are not there or people are waiting for trials, and so they start using other treatments to deal with some of these rare cancers. So sometimes patients also just get misdiagnosed. So in order just to get a patient a treatment, and there may not be anything on the market, oncologists, or hematologists may just, throw anything at that disease. And that, I think also brings another level of complexity on sometimes how patients are not found. So if you have a rare cancer, there's nothing out there. If there's a close enough diagnosis, I'll just diagnose you with that and I'll throw this treatment at you to see if it works. But then in the commercialization model, Phil, I don't know if you see this or not, then they're just characterized as the wrong diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. I wish I had hard data to back this up, but I've heard from numerous trustworthy sources that the majority of rare cancers, so the patients that we sort of talk to, are misdiagnosed at least once and often up to 3 times, right? Before somebody finally sort of lands on this is actually what the diagnosis should be. And I think harkening back to one of the things that Phil mentioned early on, right? The biomarker part of the story is very near and dear to my heart as sort of a trained genomics geneticist. But I also, because I think that mechanistic, this is actually the thing that's driving your tumor. This is a marker that's on the tumor cell. Does it matter if it was a cell from your pancreas or from your liver or from your brain? I mean, maybe, right? There are certainly anatomical details that do matter, but for a lot of the cell therapies in particular, or some of the new targeted ADCs and things like that, at least I think the goal and the hope is that what matters a lot more is the molecular driver, the molecular target, the molecular characterization. But I think even going back to this conversation about education, and it's not just for, scientists to learn how to do this stuff better. It's the clinicians, this notion of like, oh, this isn't a systemic therapy. This isn't going to kill the cancer wherever it is. Does the delivery mechanism matter? How do we have confidence that, in fact, the diagnostic test, whether it's sequencing or immunohistochemistry or whatever it is, actually reflects that you have that target and that target is targetable by the drug? Those are like, again, to Phil's point, true if you have lung cancer too.
Yeah.
But it's much more acute because we know that the general therapies don't work in rare cancers. So sort of the only option are these precision therapeutics. And those are almost definitionally molecular and mechanistically targeted. So you have to build the sort of the data about where those targets are and what their biology is and how the drugs match up to those. And you have to educate the entire sort of prescribing milieu of doctors out there, whether they're oncologists or sort of everybody else who's in that conversation, to say like, doing this test is really important because it will tell you whether there's a targeted therapy that's an option. And you have to sort of learn to believe that the targeting and the molecular characterization is actually good and matters. And I don't think, I've been saddened by the great oncologists, really great doctors, but that's not the way they were trained. Like that hasn't been the standard approach to how you decide what drug to give a patient, right? It's you go to the NCCN guidelines and you say, well, it's this kind of disease, and so you get this first and the second and this third, not what's your cancer doing? How do we pick the drug?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely, we deal with that frustration too, Marshall. I mean, it's like, and at the same time, I have a lot of empathy, and I'm sure, Phil and I see this too. Like many of our oncologists are seeing tons of cancers, many common cancers, many rare cancers. And then we throw in like, you need to stop, you need to test. And sometimes when you test, you can test 10 patients and still only get 1. I mean, we find that challenge in our clinical trials. We try to have a clinical trial. We try to get a drug out. And through the testing, which is the right thing to do, I think sometimes our oncologists just get fatigued with that, with everything else that they have to do. We don't, at least in my experience, and Phil, I don't know if you see something different, or Marshall, these oncologists are, common oncologists that are seeing many different tumor types. And to be versed in all of them, especially a rare one that you may see, as you said, once every 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, that's some of the challenge. And we even find that in our clinical trial challenge too, just trying to get people to continue to test, even though they may only see a patient 1 out of 20. So I think
it's one of the dynamic trends, I think, of our industry, Edrice, that you want the patients to be treated as close to home in the community as possible to avoid all the travel and the disruption that comes with being referred to a big city hospital. But actually, the expertise to address the new wave of science that we're delivering is not really in the community. So how do you square that circle? That's one of the challenges and also for us as where we build our footprint.
Yes.
The team support and educate medical affairs teams, MSLs, our sales teams. You've got very few patients, maybe few treaters spread across a huge geography. To what extent are they managed in the community or managed in the academic centers? And then how do you build your teams accordingly to support that? They're all fundamental considerations that are more acute in the rare disease space.
That's right.
So how do you, maybe Edrice, just pick up on that and talk about, we talked about tissue and characterization and a lot of the challenges around developing the therapies, but then you have one and you're trying to get it out. I can't remember if it was which one of you talked about different regulatory pathways, but how do you clinically study something where there might be a few hundred or a few thousand patients scattered around, and to, I think, Phil, it was your point, there's an institution that might get 1 or 2 or 3 patients a year coming through their doors that fit a certain profile, and we know it's hard enough even in very common conditions to build a clinical study, enroll patients in any reasonably efficient manner, and work through the regulatory journey and get something right. How do you do that in a situation where there's a few hundred or a few thousand patients, and what does the FDA expect of you in these situations?
Yeah, I mean, let's not give the FDA a lot of credit. I think our normal drug processes are meant for, randomized, big, large trials. But the FDA now, will have accelerated approval. They have, breakthrough designation. So I really give them a lot of credit that they've evolved for these very rare cancers of, what they expect from us, so we can actually get, I believe, drugs to market much, much faster. At the same time, I think, too, they hold a pretty high bar for safety of these drugs. I mean, we talked about chemotherapy, and again, I know many of our loved ones have benefited from that, but I think, they've just enacted this Project Optimus, is really saying we've got to have the optimal dose at the right efficacy level, but safe. And they really are holding a tight bar around making sure we have the right dose. So I do think one thing that they expect from us that maybe they didn't expect for us in the past, especially in cancer, but probably in all diseases, is that we have the right lowest dose possible to get the greatest efficacy. And so that is requiring us to, I think, have more data at different dose levels to make sure that we have efficacy and safety as the top priority. Probably in our early phase 2 in our large trials, we would test a couple doses and come forward with one dose, and that would be our dose. I think those days are gone, based on at least what we've seen in our interactions with the FDA. They want 2 doses, kind of in our main trials, to make sure that we have the lowest dose possible with the greatest efficacy. That also takes time. So, it's just the juxtaposition of, we're trying to get these drugs out. These people are very sick. And at the same time, we've had to really rethink how we bring drugs to market. I think the other thing, and Phil and I talked about this early or late last year, really patient populations. If you think about cancers like multiple myeloma, which is a more common cancer, but that patient population is more targeted towards African Americans. And so I do think the trial enrollment and percentages that we have across populations, they are really holding, and they should, a hard bar around making sure that we have the populations in our studies that these treatments can really benefit. And again, we've still got our work cut out for us. Again, I don't know, Phil, how you guys are thinking about that, but we still have our work cut out for us to make sure we've got the right dose and the right populations.
I would pick up on the point, Steven, you asked about, some of these physicians may see 3-4 cases a year of this particular condition. So how do you have that just-in-time approach? And that's where data it really helps. It helps us help our ecosystem, the healthcare ecosystem. So, the biomarkers is a great example. If you're able to get data from labs that shows in a certain area, there's been a test for a certain mutation associated with a particular cancer in a rare disease, maybe that's an indication that someone is thinking about in that area of treating a patient with that condition, and maybe your drug can play a role. So we're learning, and with AI, machine learning, we're learning to interrogate the massive data that's out there, so that perhaps we can have that just-in-time approach to our go-to-market model and deploy an MSL or a salesperson to go in and make sure that area, you can't necessarily get it down to the individual physician, but you can understand if a hospital or an area is actually on the brink of maybe treating one of these patients. Then you can marshal all of your resources to actually get to that institution at the right time with information that's relevant at that time, which is critical, rather than seeing them 3 months before and it in one ear and out the other, and it's a waste of everyone's time and effort.
I think one of the places that this is maybe one of the places where foundations have an interesting opportunity to help, and I've seen this be effective, right? A lot of, we're a pan cancer organization, and so I'm not an expert in any particular rare cancer, but we work very closely with a lot of institutions that are, right? So there, you pick a rare cancer, and usually there is some foundation that's, often put together by a family member or a patient themselves, and they want to sort of do better for that community. And those groups, Phil, to your point, I think a lot of times are really tightly connected. They're very close-knit groups of patients. They share that kind of information amongst themselves and with, the select set of doctors who have sort of come forward as, hey, I'm seeing patients with this disease. I've had some experience, I haven't seen hundreds because there aren't hundreds, but you end up with these sort of relationships between those foundations, the group of patients, and a set of oncologists. And I think there's a lot of sort of latent expertise that's sitting in that combination of data and people and their conversations. And so being able to connect to them, whether you're a pharma or just an oncologist, and being willing to say, hey, I have this patient with this really rare cancer, and I'm not really sure, like, what should I do? Right? Mm-hmm. Like having that as a support model. And I know a lot of those foundations are more than willing to have those conversations, right? You go to ASCO, they all have booths, and you go up to any one of them, and they're like, hey, I have a friend with XYZ. Like, they'll introduce you to the doctor. They'll tell you what the latest is in the clinical space. Like, they're there to really know what's what on the ground. And I think that's a place that everybody could tap into, just plugging our friends in some sense. It's like, they may not always have the answer, but they often will be plugged into at least the bulk of the information that's out there about that particular disease.
You talk a little, Ben, there's a question from somebody, a little bit more about artificial intelligence, and that technology has been evolving very rapidly, as we've all seen. And Phil, you sort of mentioned, applying artificial intelligence and machine learning to sets of data. How effective is that in different steps of the process? You could imagine that there's a role for that in the really early stage, Marshall, in the areas where you're playing, all the way down to commercializing and finding the patients based on certain patterns that are showing up in clinical presentation. How are you all seeing that change, and with the rate of the sort of speed of development of artificial intelligence over the last decade? What do you see on the horizon that might really change the way this entire process of developing drugs for rare cancers evolves? Marshall, I'll start with you.
So I think it's obviously a very prescient question, right? I mean, even the Nobel sort of announcements from the last week are right in that space. I think for us, there are sort of two parts of my answer. One is that I think one of the big challenges for data aggregation, data donation, like really understanding the picture on these, is that a lot of the relevant information that we probably care about for these rare cancers is hidden in clinician notes, right? In the EHRs or wherever you're getting patient records, that stuff isn't structured, right? It isn't a lab value necessarily. There are going to be cases where there's like, oh, there's this lab value is a thing that matters. But there are many, many more cases where it's really whatever the doctor has written in the notes about how the patient has progressed and their ups and downs. That has historically been nearly impossible to turn into actionable quantitative data that you could then say, go do predictions on or use for sort of data-driven work. I think that we are very close to a world where LLMs and related technologies are going to enable reasonably reliable abstraction of that stuff from medical records in a way that hasn't happened before. Now, we're not there right now, at least as far as I can tell. And we've tried with a number of groups and people are getting better at it. The challenge, of course, and I wonder if this is maybe why Phil is smiling, that like, I think there are some companies who can abstract non-small cell lung cancer records really well because there are a lot of them to train on. And then you have like, oh, some very rare sarcoma, and there isn't any of that in the training set. So it you know, the model doesn't quite do the job yet. So we're still seeing that most people have to do the data abstraction manual, which is really expensive and really time consuming. So I do think that we will get there, but I don't know when. Like, it feels like we're on the precipice, but it's felt like we've been on the precipice for a little while now. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also cautious.
That's why I was smiling, because I was thinking for more the commercialization end. I was at a industry conference in Philadelphia last year, and everyone talks a great game. All companies talk a great game about AI, machine learning, precision customer engagement, efficient models, impactful, being relevant. You know, no one's cracked the code, at least from what I can see. There's lots of different experiments going on all across our industry, which is fantastic. But I don't think anyone's necessarily cracked the code of exactly what AI means. From my perspective, it's always going to be the human capital and the machine, if you like, together, that's going to make us as effective as possible. I don't think we're going to dispense with the human being anytime soon, because that face-to-face, person-to-person relationship is critical. But I think what AI can do is facilitate that when those people are together, what we're doing is providing something that is absolutely relevant, absolutely at the right time to the right person, and is actionable in that moment. We've been too hit and miss as an industry because we haven't been able to pull those things together. I think we're getting to the stage now where data and analytics and artificial intelligence and our human capital can do a much better job. So I'm really excited about that, but I'm waiting for the first company that really says we've cracked the code here.
It's funny, Phil.
Maybe you have.
People are in front of me all the time about this. When you figure out who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth, let me know. But yeah, I mean, people are talking to us about this all the time, and I'm with you. I'm having a hard time figuring out really when we've hit the mark. It's hard to know.
Well, and I think the other thing I was going to say about the sort of the AI revolution in general is that there's no question a lot of these approaches, the algorithms, the sort of sophisticated neural nets, and some of the hardware capabilities can actually do pretty remarkable stuff, but they are fairly dependent on the quality of the training data and then the query data. And so this is a place where we try to be very thoughtful, which is there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of VC money, there's a lot of excitement about research into like the next great algorithm and the next great neural net and then whatever it is. And those things will only ever be as useful as the data that's used to put into them. And that stuff isn't an AI problem, right? That's make sure you reliably capture the data at the site where the patient is being seen. Make sure that, you remove opportunities for human error. Make sure that you model that data in a thoughtful way so that you can port it into those systems easily and relatively inexpensively. That's all boring plumbing stuff, right? It really is. Like, this isn't the stuff that computer scientists get excited about doing because we know how to do it right. It's boring and expensive and it takes a lot of time and it's all that stuff that isn't sexy and it isn't fun to talk about and it doesn't get you giant VC checks. But if we don't do it, we're going to have all of this like shining, incredible technology and not be able to put anything of value into it, which means we won't get anything of value out of it. And so that's sort of my other slight soapbox there is there's a lot of focus on that middle part and a pretty limited focus on let's make sure that we're collecting the data carefully and thoughtfully. We're annotating it, well, with good metadata. We have reliable sort of human, and this is a lot of human problem, right? That's why it's not just a software problem.
Yeah.
So there's a few questions about that, and maybe just stay on that topic for a moment more, which is what would have to happen in order for, there's a question about, big pharma companies having huge libraries that are proprietary to themselves. And you mentioned data that lives in EMRs, and, there's all these different data sets, and you talked about the plumbing and stuff. I mean, what needs to happen in order for, this dream world that one of the people in the audience sort of put into a question, which is all that data is connected and available and can be accessed and queried and analyzed. Is that a realistic aspiration, or is that not how the world will evolve?
No, I think we're getting there, because a lot of this is being democratized now. This access to data is being democratized in a way that was all just too elite and beyond reach before. I think what we're getting to the stage where we can pull in huge amounts of data and stuff can be done with it. And we've got technology now that can spit out stuff that we can then make decisions on in a far better way. But I think to Marshall's point earlier, it's still what my goal, for instance, when dealing with a commercial team, a sales team, is not to say, do what the machine tells you. It's the machine can come up with a bunch of suggestions based upon the profile and the information they have of the physician, the institution, the setting, you name it. But it will give options for then the human to move forward with and make an intelligent decision based upon the feed from the machine, as it were. But it's not the machine saying, here you go from A to B. It's, here's some information. I think this will help you be more effective in your interaction with this institution next time. And therefore it informs, it's insight driven in a way that we haven't had before. I don't think we're going to bypass that straight to execution, or you can, but in ways that are just information provision. When it comes to complex areas, decision-making, dialogue, and interaction, you want to feed insight-driven suggestions, which can then be acted upon or not, or acted upon later. That's my view of where we're at in the exciting juncture that we're at there.
So yeah, and I think I could say for these rare diseases, we don't have a lot of data, Steven. And so I think while it's not perfect, AI may be sometimes the only way. As Marshall's saying, we got to go into the claims data. We have to see where these diagnoses are. When you're talking about 10, 20, 100 patients, what we have in big pharma sometimes is just driven by research and data analytics. But when you're talking about ultra rare diseases, we don't always have it. And while not perfect, I think AI is something that we can rely on that can go into a claims data, because there may be only 20 physicians in the whole world that are even treating these cancers. So I think at least from my perspective, how I see it is, we'll crawl, walk, and run in this. But when it comes to ultra rare, I'm happy that we've got some of these, while they're not perfect, opportunities to go into claims and find out where these patients are so we can get our treatments to them.
I'd maybe extend that very slightly also to say that, and I think this came up earlier, the rare cancer patients that we work with tend to, by necessity, be much more motivated on average than your sort of average cancer patient to participate in research, to donate their data, to donate their tissue, do all this stuff. HIPAA says you own your medical records. So the way Pattern does data donation is we sort of cut out the middleman, so to speak, right? We say directly to the patients, like, this is your information. You can go request it, or we can do it on your behalf. But fundamentally, the patient can say, I want to put my medical records out into the world to let researchers just see them and find what they can find in them. And I'm certainly not going to put words in Phil or Edrice's mouth here, but like, I've talked to other pharmas and other biotechs, and a lot of them are similarly interested in this sort of non-siloed open science collaboration around rare cancers, because it's pretty obvious none of them are going to figure this out on their own, right? Even if you take a strictly, I have to protect my capital, I have to make sure that my shareholders get what they get. I think most people realize no one company can actually get the answer for one of these rare diseases because it is just so hard to get that data together. So the only way anybody's going to get a piece of that pie is to work together. So I think it's actually a really promising opportunity to do, there's that whole notion of open science and sort of open collaboration that's been around since the 80s and kind of fits and starts. I think there's an argument to be made that rare diseases, rare cancers are a real opportunity to break down those silos between corporations, between individual corporations, academics, foundations, and just work together for the benefit of the patient. And then everybody does get a piece of the sort of resulting, outcome.
I cannot agree with you more, Marshall. When I think about one of the products right now that ultra rare, we will not be able to do it on our own. We will have to rely on advocacy groups, foundations, institutions, regulatory bodies. We will not be able to do it on our own. And so I do think that ultra rare cancers will break down some of the kind of behaviors that we've seen in the past. We cannot do it on our own.
As an organization matter that was sort of founded on a premise that collaboration is the best, if not the only way to really innovate in healthcare, I love the direction that this conversation is going. And as we kind of wrap up here, as we get to the top of the hour, I think it's a perfect place to kind of land. I think I have learned a lot about both the barriers, but also the opportunities, and I think there's certainly a lot of work to do. If we go back to the beginning of this conversation, when we were talking about only 5% of rare diseases have effective treatments, we clearly have a lot of work to do. But optimistic based on what you are all saying, that both the infrastructure and some of the foundational pieces are evolving, the technology is evolving to analyze data in ways that can really help, and companies on the commercialization end of things are focusing more and more on these rare conditions. So I think I'm optimistic that we're heading in the right direction. Really appreciate all of your expertise and thoughts and your time, and appreciate what you are all doing in this space. And for everybody who is listening, if you enjoyed this conversation, you can go to matter.health/events, and you'll see other upcoming conversations that we are having. Thanks everybody for joining. Particular grateful to you, Marshall and Phil and Edrice, for your time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Steven.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.